Hello, everyone. My name is Shibani, and I work at Carnegie India. On behalf of my colleagues, I would like to welcome you to our webinar on evolving dynamics in West Asia and their implications for regional stability and international relations. Over the past year, we've witnessed a significant escalation in West Asia, with the conflict expanding beyond Israel and Palestine to involve multiple regional actors, including Iran, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. This regional expansion has heightened the stakes for external actors, particularly India and the United States. Our distinguished panelists are familiar names to those of you who follow the region. Their exceptional work speaks for itself, and we're eager to sort of jump into the conversation. So I won't spend time on detailed introductions, but very briefly, Ambassador Navdeep Singh Suri, who is former Indian ambassador to the UAE, Dr. Deepika Saraswat, Associate Fellow at the West Asia Center at MPIDSA, Ambassador Gadam Dharmendra, who's former Indian ambassador to Iran, and Mr. Kabir Taneja, who's Deputy Director and Fellow for Middle East Studies at the Observer Research Foundation. Together, they bring diplomatic experience, academic rigor, and policy expertise to understand this critical moment in world politics. Before I turn to the panel, I would like to frame today's discussion with some key developments. As I said in the starting, the past 13 months have shown us how quickly regional dynamics can shift. What began as a localized conflict has rippled across the entire region, creating ever-widening circles of effect. We've seen this play out from Gaza to Lebanon's borders, from the Red Sea shipping lanes to proxy activities in Syria and Iraq. Notably, despite these multiple fronts, the conflict has largely remained within a certain strategic threshold. For example, the incidents in the Red Sea that disrupted global shipping, or the responses between Israel and Hezbollah along the Lebanon southern border, we've seen a pattern of escalation and de-escalation. On the diplomatic front, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation and the Arab League have held multiple high-level meetings. These gatherings, while symbolically significant, have been more process-oriented than outcome-driven. Egypt and Qatar continue their traditional mediating roles, while Saudi Arabia performs a balancing act, considering normalization with Israel while managing regional stability concerns. And then there are the external stakeholders, particularly the United States. The previous Trump administration's policies led to strategic realignment in the region, from the Abraham Accords to the maximum pressure campaign on Iran. These fundamentally altered the regional dynamics. For India, the stakes are not limited to the 8.7 million strong diaspora or the remittances that they send home. Projects like the Middle East Europe Economic Corridor are strategic bridges that link multiple parts of the region, or the Chabahar port, the development of which represents India's careful balancing act between regional partners. Looking ahead, we face complex web of challenges: the situation in Gaza, maritime security concerns, nuclear risks. They're all interconnected challenges that need nuanced responses. Before I turn to Ambassador Suri, I would like to remind our participants that they are free to send their questions in the Q&A chat box, and as moderator, I will pick them and we can ask them to the panelists. Ambassador Suri, you have been at the forefront of India's relations with countries in West Asia, in Africa, as well as the United States. As we look ahead at the second Trump presidency, what is your assessment of how the Gulf-Israel relations might evolve, particularly Trump's personal equations with Netanyahu, with MBS, And how do you see the interplay between domestic politics in the US affecting regional realignments as well as the broader peace process?
Uh, Thank you, Shivani, for hosting this event at a really interesting time. As you said, with the Trump presidency about 6 weeks away, everybody's watching in the region and beyond the region what its implications are. But I think before we look at Trump 2.0, it's useful to look at what happened in Trump 1.0. And I know I'm grossly perhaps oversimplifying this, but let me look at three aspects of Trump 1.0 in West Asia. I think one was the very solidly pro-Israel position that he took, including recognizing Jerusalem as the capital, which is something that I don't think any other country had done. Um, Jared Kushner was very actively involved in the whole engagement with Israel and with West Asia. And of course, there were those flawed and overambitious attempt to come up with a deal of the century, which, when you looked at it closely, looked more like a real estate deal than a real peace settlement to anyone looking at it. But the second aspect was quite interesting to me, which was the close ties that he had with Saudi Arabia and with UAE in particular. And the third, which is kind of linked to the second, was his hardline approach on Iran, scrapping the nuclear deal and the policy of maximum pressure, as you said. What this did was it created a very large degree of convergence between the US administration and the countries in the Gulf, particularly, as I said, the Saudis and the Emiratis, who kind of are the leaders in that area. They really hated the nuclear deal, and the antipathy towards President Obama that I saw when I was in Abu Dhabi really came as a bit of a surprise, because they felt that the Obama administration, in focusing on the nuclear deal, had forgotten their other concerns, which were the missile proliferation from Iran, the asymmetric warfare, and particularly Iran's intervention in the internal affairs of countries in the Gulf, using perhaps elements of the Shia minority as a bridgehead. So you heard these fears of a Shia crescent from the Houthis in Yemen all the way to the Hezbollah in Lebanon. And so you saw how that convergence of interests between UAE, between Israel, which pretty much was speaking the same language, and the Emiratis and the Americans, led to the Abraham Accords, which really were quite a path-breaking endeavor. And at the same time, I think you saw India, a convergence with India's interests, and India having very close relations with the Emiratis, very close relations with Israel, very close relations with the United States, kind of led to the emergence of I2U2 as the India, Israel, US, UAE grouping that would emerge as a new minilateral to take advantage of economic opportunities in a bunch of different areas that were identified. Take that forward, and you have the G20 summit in India, and from the womb of G20 and the Abraham Accords together emerges this India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor. And of course, October 7 happened, the Gaza war happened, and there was a feeling that this is a real setback to the ambitious scope of the India, Middle East, Europe corridor, and certainly I2U2 temporarily was to go on a back burner. But when we look at it closely, that's not exactly true. Some elements of I2U2, particularly the India-UAE food corridor, have continued to progress, even if it's on a sort of a bilateral basis. I personally thought that given the antipathy towards Israel in parts of the Arab world, the positions that have emerged from Saudi Arabia, very vocally from the leadership, I thought that the India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor really will not progress in any significant way. But surprise, surprise, at least on the eastern part of the corridor, which is India, UAE, India, Saudi Arabia, you've seen a bunch of meetings take place for the renewable energy, grid connectivity, for a virtual trade corridor. So work is already happening sort of quietly and behind the scenes. And we saw substantive discussions on this both during Crown Prince Sheikh Khalid's visit to India from UAE last month, and the more recent visit of our External Affairs Minister to UAE. So coming to the Trump 2.0 then, within this scenario, I think that it is going to give a very strong momentum to some of these elements that had been set into motion over the last few years. There's the advantage that President Trump will enjoy a very close personal relationship, not just with Prime Minister Modi, which we know. Prime Minister Modi was one of the first leaders to congratulate him, and they had a long conversation. And they don't, President Trump hasn't hidden his affection for Prime Minister Modi. But he also has a very close relationship with Prime Minister Netanyahu, with Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed in UAE, and of course with Sheikh Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia. So I think, that makes it quicker and faster for the new Trump administration to pick up where they left off. And even if there's a new cast of characters around in the cabinet, for things to move forward. The other driver, which you won't hear spoken about as much when you talk of I2U2 or IMEC, is the China factor. You see a bunch of real China hawks in the new Trump administration, in the incoming Trump administration. So to the extent that the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor promises secure data connectivity, secure and resilient supply links, and the unspoken thought of being a bit of an alternate to the BRI, I think you will see that China is the elephant in the room that may not get spoken about too much. But while you have these positive elements, I think there's also one strong negative element that you need to take into account, which is not just the fact that the war in Gaza is dragging on without an end game in sight, but also the sentiment that it has generated in large segments of the Arab world, including in countries like UAE, which established diplomatic ties with Israel, and Saudi Arabia, which seemed very ready to normalize ties with Israel. I mean, I can tell you from personal experience and visits that there's a real feeling that Prime Minister Netanyahu and his cabinet's hardline policies, the Knesset resolution on against a two-state solution or against a Palestinian state, all of that has deeply embarrassed the leadership in Gulf countries that was only 5 years back really rooting for a much broader normalization with Israel. So I guess even though there is no love lost in Abu Dhabi or in Riyadh for Hezbollah or for Hamas, no tears would be shed really over their demise. But the fact that UAE had sort of promised that annexation would be held off of territories in the West Bank, etc., really has put them in a difficult situation now. The utterances of members of Netanyahu cabinet have put them in a very difficult situation. And I think it really remains to be seen how much the new Trump administration is willing to invest in taking a peace process forward, not perhaps the deal of the century, but maybe something innovative. You hear ideas that the two-state solution, is it really possible? Is it really viable? Should people look at a one state in which all Palestinians have equal rights, et cetera, et cetera? I think those are some of the elements on the table, and it'll be really interesting to see how we proceed on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Suri. I think you've laid out all the elements and moving parts when it comes to US's approach to the region, while also telling us what the sentiment from within the region has been towards Trump and Trump 1.0. Dr. Saraswat, could you tell us how Tehran is viewing these regional shifts? Ambassador Suri sort of brought Iran up a couple of times in his remarks. So, what are your thoughts on how Iran's establishment is preparing for the changes in the US leadership, especially given the recent responses to regional escalation?
Right. So if the Trump administration was to pick up from where it left off, in the Trump 1.0, as Ambassador Suri just spoke about, that's a disaster for Tehran. And, the maximum pressure and the very pro-Israeli stance on the territorial annexation of territories, or taking a more aggressive approach towards Iran, in terms of what we saw in terms of targeting of senior Iranian officials, killing of General Soleimani, and sabotage of nuclear facilities in Iran. That was a new kind of aggressive approach that we saw from Israel under the previous term of President Trump. So I think last 3 or 4 years, Iranians have sustained the maximum pressure. They've turned around their regional equations to some extent. So that gives them, some solace in terms of how the Gulf states are not going to join Israel in securitizing Iran. So that's a change. But at the same time, last 1 year, the regional escalation that has happened, and how Iran and Israel are engaged in direct confrontation, and how Iranian deterrence has been eroded, the excess of resistance, and bringing this more direct confrontation between Iran and Israel. That also makes the Islamic Republic really worried that Israel might get a freer hand, in terms of dealing with the nuclear issue. If given the Prime Minister Netanyahu has been, sort of taking, like having dealt with Hamas to the extent possible, and the Northern Front in Hezbollah now taking the war to Iran, that's the kind of message that Netanyahu has been sending across, and it might find more receptive ears in the Trump administration. So that's something that really worries the Islamic Republic, and we see what sort of Trump proofing that has been happening in last 1 month or so, which is further intensifying of regional diplomacy by Iranian officials. The foreign minister visiting, just before the Israelis retaliated, the foreign minister has visited more than a dozen countries in the region, trying to convince them that Iran is not seeking regional war. It does not want further escalation. And then if at all the regional countries were to participate in Israeli action against Iran, then also warning them about consequences. So I think the Gulf states sort of understand that the previous round of maximum pressure really got them in a difficult situation in terms of exposure of their energy facilities or their shipping. So and given their focus on economic these Vision 2030 and this diversification, that's economic diversification that's they've been focusing on, they would not want to be part of a stringent or maximum pressure 2.0, if one was to put it that way. They would want to keep the tensions under the threshold that they've been so far, and but at the same time, one has to understand that President Trump is unpredictable. I mean, that's something that he sees an advantage, the unpredictability that is sort of associated with him there. So while he withdrew from the JCPOA, he kept sort of boasting that he can get a better deal. It's him, he can get a better deal than anybody else. And the Secretary Pompeo had presented a list of 12 demands, which, of course, Iranians, refused to sort of consider, saying that they will not negotiate under pressure. So what I'm saying here is that given the mandate, the massive mandate that President Trump has got, and the control of, the Republican control of the Congress and the Senate, So he is sort of better positioned to sort of seek a deal with Iran, and the signals that you get with Elon Musk meeting the Iranian, permanent representative in the UN, to the UN. So there is a possibility that Iran might show some heroic flexibility once again, and given the dire strait it is in terms of domestic pressure, and the reform is seeking to relieve that pressure, and the regional, the erosion of its deterrence, Iranians may seek engagement, which is what they are suggesting. If the new administration was to respond with a diplomatic outreach, then Iranians are indicating that they will be willing to talk to the Trump administration. So that's all for now.
Thank you, Dr. Saraswat. I think you raised a lot of points that I would like to come back in maybe my second round of questions, whether it's the axis of resistance or JCPOA withdrawal. Ambassador Dharmendra, we can't talk about Iran without getting into the conversation about nuclear risks. Could you share your insights on how you see these various threats, whether it's regional security architecture, the nuclear dynamics, and the strategic alignments sort of coming together?
Yeah, thank you, Shivani. Great to be here, and with a very distinguished panel. I think Ambassador Suri and Dr. Saraswat have laid out much on the table for us to discuss. I think, yes, all eyes are on what's going to happen in 6 weeks' time. We have some ideas how Trump will approach the region in terms of his nominations. I think Ambassador Suri has laid that out for us. Interesting, we'll have to see. First, he wants an intersessional quick nomination process to be approved by the Senate so they can all get cracking soon after his swearing-in ceremony. But I think the groundwork is being laid broadly. We have reports, particularly on the Israel-Lebanon front, we have reports of a possible ceasefire that would enable some of the displaced, tens of thousands of Israelis who've been displaced to the south to return to the north. I think that was one of Israel's limited offensive objectives. But overall, if there is a ceasefire in Lebanon, then what will be the consequences for the Gaza in terms of hostage exchange, hostage release? We're not seeing any progress on that front. So on that part of the West Asia, which is actually led to some serious concerns on escalation, de-escalation strategies, we have still some uncertainty on the Gaza front. Let's hope there'll be ceasefire in Lebanon. The other interesting thing is, I think Ambassador Suri did refer to that, there has been a weakening of Iran's forward defense strategy. I think we'll have to see that in terms of how Iran will now respond to any overtures the Trump administration may make. They're definitely in a weaker position in terms of conventional capabilities. The axis of resistance, both in in Lebanon and in Syria and the Gaza have been weakened. Yemen, of course, the Houthis are still causing trouble, particularly to the security of supply chains and global shipping. Interesting that Hamas has relocated from Qatar to Turkey. Turkey, as we all know, is a NATO ally, so we'll have to see how that works out in terms of any resolution on Palestine and Gaza. How will Trump approach? There is obviously a change in the regional situation. Iran and the Gulf countries have reconciled, particularly Iran and Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. We see they've exchanged ambassadors, diplomatic missions have reopened. There's been a lot of exchange. So while Foreign Minister Arakchi has made multiple regional trips, he has been focused on the Saudis particularly. I think he's had a couple of meetings in the recent past to see how they can resolve it. So multiple developments are taking place. The Iranians have also responded to Trump particularly Foreign Minister Arakchi, by saying that this policy of maximum pressure has led to maximum resistance, and let's hope there'll be maximum wisdom now from the Americans. So we'll have to see how this plays out. Given the appointments so far in terms of Secretary of State Marco Rubio, the CIA director and the special envoy for the Middle East, and the US PR to the UN, we see all hardliners, all fairly pro-Israel group of cabinet coming into play. How that will work out, we'll have to see. But as Dr. Saraswat said, Trump is unpredictable, and he can obviously cut a deal as and when needed. From the Iranian perspective, we'll have to keep a couple of things in mind. I'll just add to what Deepika said. One of them is with the election of President Pezeshkian, we see that the hardliners and the pragmatists, there's been a balance. The pragmatists like Arakchi, former Foreign Minister Javad Zarif, they're all back in play. And of course, they're making the right move so far. We'll have to see how that goes. Given the setbacks the Axis has faced in the broader West Asia, the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, which is tasked with external policy in the region, has been somewhat on the back foot, particularly with the assassination of multiple leaders of Hamas and Hezbollah, and also the last Israeli strikes in Iran, which we still have mixed information, but the Israelis claim that they now have freedom to operate at will within Iran. So we'll have to see how that plays out. But hopefully going forward, we'll have some positive developments. On the internal front, again, I just want to focus on one thing. Economic stability has been a priority of the Pezeshkian government, and the news is pretty good. The economic growth rates are around 4%, riding on the back of oil sales, particularly to China. I think all these taken together, the socio-economic indicators are stable. The Iran Statistical Center has given some figures about oil exports. I think they're doing about 17 to 20% of GDP is coming from oil, particularly exports to China. So if Trump comes in and he decides to tighten the sanctions regime, particularly on oil, the energy sector, then Iran may come under some pressure. Lastly, on the nuclear side, we just had Grossi, DG IAEA, conclude a long overdue visit to Iran, at the end of which they are all hoping that there will be some progress. Mohammad Islami, the head of the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran, has said that inspections are continuing. Iran is abiding by its commitments under the NPT, not under the JCPOA, under the NPT. We'll have to be clear about that. And so comprehensive safeguards on Iran are operational, but not the additional protocol, which are much more intrusive. Second, related to the nuclear issue is Iran has amassed enriched uranium way beyond the JCPOA limits. So we're looking at 1.6 tons of enriched uranium to 2%, equal amount, 1.6 tons to enrich to about 20%. And of course, there's about 200 odd kgs of enriched to 60%. This is all the 60% enrichment is very, very high. And Iran is the only NPT non-nuclear weapon state to amass such a high amount of uranium. Now, is this a negotiating tactic? What is the way forward? We'll have to wait and see how that plays out. But by and large, comments from inside the Iranian establishment, particularly those very close to the supreme leader, non-official and officials like former Foreign Minister Kamal Karazi. Lately, it has been Ahmad Javad Larijani, all of them whom have said that, Iran is now a nuclear threshold state. They don't use the word weapon, but they say Iran is a nuclear threshold state. So we'll have to see if Trump, the deal maker, can persuade the Iranians to come back to the negotiating table. I'll quickly conclude here by saying that the Saudis, the Israelis were all very vehemently opposed to the JCPOA. But look what has happened with the demise of with the suspension of the JCPOA. Iran has breached all limits imposed by the JCPOA. And JCPOA is due to expire in October next year. So we'll have to see. Arakchi has already said that given the changed situation, the JCPOA can be a reference document, and we'll have to negotiate a new document. I think these are positive steps, but I think the Iranians are also laying the groundwork for future negotiations with Trump. Now, if you remember, during the Biden administration, particularly over the last year and a half, the Iranians and the Americans have been talking, but indirectly. There has been no direct communication. Basically, they would sit in Vienna in two different buildings, and chits would go between the negotiators in two buildings, which was really, really very difficult process of negotiations and quite unproductive, which is exactly what happened. Now we'll have to see whether the old framework of direct negotiations will start. So first, some roadmap. I think the next IAEA report will be due in March 2025, the first quarter. So that'll be about a month and a half after Trump's swearing in. That could give lay the framework for some negotiations and discussions on the nuclear front. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. That's a very sort of comprehensive picture of what's happening in Iran. Mr. Taneja, you keep a close watch on India's strategic interests in the region. How do you see sort of New Delhi navigating these choppy waters and balancing multiple strategic partnerships while protecting its core security interests?
Thank you, Shibani. It was great to hear the distinguished panel lay out the lay of the land as it stands right now in the Middle East so eloquently. Look, there's been a lot of debate about what India's position should be or has been and in the future could be. And there were a lot of conversations also, especially after Prime Minister Modi tweeted in October 2023, soon after the attack took place by Hamas against Israel, sort of condemning it in strong terms, and that was a sort of almost a shift in position from an Indian point of view on how it usually approaches the region. I particularly, very personally, didn't see that in that light, at least. I think India, like it always does, tries to maintain a very, very fine trapeze wire act in the Middle East. What we are witnessing in Gaza is extremely difficult to digest. But the conflict by itself is not new. The intensity is probably the highest the conflict has ever seen, but the fundamentals of what is taking place and the historiography of the Palestinian issue remains a constant. So as far as India's positions are concerned, I think they have been constant with it. India has maintained that look, the two-state solution needs to be a final solution, so to speak, and that is the only way this can be quote unquote resolved. Now there are of course multiple variables to how that functions or what a two-state solution is. But I think more than many other countries, India has tried to sort of give some color to those arguments in the shape of, for example, saying the two-state solution also needs to recognize Israeli sovereignty and security interests, along with the Palestinian ones. And of course, going back to 1988, India recognized the Palestinian state a long time ago. Beyond that, I think there has been a lot of conversations about, can India play a mediator's role? Is India in a position to play that kind of role? Now there are two ideations to that from my point of view. First is, of course, that India is in a unique position that it has good relations with Iran, it has good relations with Israel, and it has particularly good relations with the Arab world as of today. And I think from a New Delhi point of view, maintenance of that is quite important, and that that automatically, I think, puts any idea of a mediation or an official mediator's role on the sidelines. Now, of course, that does not mean that India cannot do anything. I think India is in a position to relay messages, relay narratives, have wholesome conversations with all the parties involved on potential ways forward. And there are two ambassadors in this room. I'm sure that has happened in some shape or form also in the past. But I think a lot of the mediation talk that came over the past couple of months is sort of India's own of India's own making more than anything else. India has been very vocal about multipolarity, for example, and India's wish to be a pole within that construct. And when you market that, obviously some of the more contentious events taking place in the world, there will be calls for an Indian opinion to it, or more than an opinion, an Indian action to it. But the interesting part about that is that I like that in very fleeting passing moment, India's external affairs minister did say that when all this happens, that India cannot be completely risk averse all the time. Now, India's, in my view, again, India has played fairly risk-averse roles in the past. But of course, if it is going to move towards its own ideation of what a multipolar world is going to look like, and of course what its position is going to be, there will be pressure on taking not sides or stance, which are the two words we often hear on these crises, but taking a position. Or having a strong sort of view on the way let's say, negotiations should go or should take place, or what kind of negotiations should take place, something, right, instead of nothing. So I think a lot of the narratives around India's position in the past couple of months have been around broader frameworks of how broader global geopolitics is moving, rather than just what is happening in Gaza, because we've seen sprinklings of that on India's narratives on Ukraine and Russia as well. So, that's one sort of broad point to make on this. I'll just very quickly touch upon why a lot of people think that India's position did pivot a little bit towards Israel. I think it's not completely a baseless thing to say. I think the fact that India really, really rushed and released a statement at the highest level in October condemning the terror attack largely comes from the fact that India, over the past couple of years, has put terrorism on the pedestal as something that really, really needs to be taken into account globally. And global terrorism narratives have also fallen slightly, offbeat when it comes to the broader frameworks on what we are discussing when it comes to global security and national security. India has, I think, 2022, if I remember correctly, India also hosted the UN Counterterrorism Committee meeting in Delhi, which usually doesn't happen anywhere outside New York. It's not a normal precedence. So I think a lot of that movement came from India's push on putting terrorism as an issue back on the global pedestal, which India has been fairly vocal about. And through that, yes, I think there was a slight potentially misbalance of how India positioned itself initially, because if you see the subsequent statements made, including the one by Dr. Jaishankar and by the Indian Ministry of External Affairs, they have said that, look, the civilian count in the civil casualty count in Gaza is inexcusable. They have tried to send in some humanitarian aid as well. And overall, of course, the broader Indian security interests remain of what they have always been in the region. First is, of course, diaspora. You mentioned that India has about 8.7 million people working in the region, and now you cannot evacuate 8.7 million people from the region if it really goes into a very regional dynamic of this conflict. And of course, next is energy security. India still imports over 80% of its energy security. Of course, it's diversified more from the Middle East over the past couple of years, but Middle East still remains our core sort of provider, so to speak. So I think that has been largely sort of India's position, but also you have to remember from a security point of view, India has also been a place where attacks sort of have taken place against the Israeli mission here, which have been blamed on multiple actors, including Iran. And that is something that India is very cognizant about, that there are domestic implications to what happens in the Middle East, and management of those domestic implications are very, very important. Especially the kind of sort of polarization we see sort of on a global scale right now. So that's just very quickly a couple of points that I wanted to put out as far as how India has been thinking on this issue over the past couple of months. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think it's important context that you've set about India not looking at this as an isolated incident or a moment in time, but over a period of time, what India's interests have been in the region. And I was just wondering while you were speaking, what are the red lines? What is the threshold when India needs to take a position? Because right now, like you said, we're not picking sides, we're not taking any positions. So that was just something that came to me. I'd like now to kind of look at what many people call the day after scenarios. And there are several dimensions to explore here, from immediate stabilization to sort of longer term regional implications. Ambassador Suri, there are reports that suggest there's been an active back channel between Saudi and Israel, despite the current tensions. What would you think would be specific conditions that Saudi Arabia might put forward for normalization of ties with Israel, and what might make Israel sort of concede? And do you think the Abraham Accords can serve as a framework or a template?
So I think, some of the optimism that had been generated by the Abraham Accords has dissipated. Look at the Emiratis and the Saudis. I think one reason why the Emiratis went ahead and signed the Abraham Accords and the Saudis did not is that Saudi Arabia is unique. The King of Saudi Arabia is also the custodian of the two holy mosques. There's a certain Muslim sentiment that he has to take into account. There is a certain local sentiment that he has to take into account, and a pan-Islamic one. So I think given all of that, the Saudis were certainly one step behind, while the Emiratis could go ahead and normalize. But I'm aware of the backlash even that the Emiratis faced. The Palestinians, of course, were very, very skeptical about the Abraham Accords. And the only thing that could be said by the Emiratis is that we got a promise from Netanyahu that you will refrain from doing any further annexations of lands in the West Bank. And that's what I meant, that the fact that there is a creeping annexation that is continuing to happen day after day after day in broad daylight, being documented by virtually every major organization, is deeply embarrassing for countries that stuck their neck out for a normalization of relations with Israel. That makes it even harder for the Saudis. So on your point about the Saudis' position, I think they've said it very clearly that they are now linking normalization with some kind of pathway towards Palestinian self-determination. There was the old Saudi-led Arab Peace Initiative, which said that all the Arab countries would come and normalize relations with Israel if there were a two-state solution based on the 1967 borders, with East Jerusalem, Gaza, and West Bank as the core of a Palestinian state. And that really brings, I feel that the anomaly that we are faced with today is that everybody, whether it's India, whether it is the United States, whether it's the United Nations, everybody talks of a two-state solution without anyone showing you a pathway to a two-state solution. I have spoken with my Palestinian friends, and I've spoken with others, and the pragmatic ones realize that there is no realistic scenario today in which you are going to envisage Israelis withdrawing from the West Bank, dismantling all of the 600, 700 odd settlements that have come up. If that is the case, and you also see a rightward shift in domestic Israeli politics manifested in the Knesset resolution against a Palestinian state. So how do you get a two-state, right? And that's where I think that at some point, whether it is countries like India, whether it is others, you have to start looking at what are the alternatives available to you rather than, yes, there's Resolution 242, Resolution 338, the Camp David Accords, the Oslo Accords. Everything was vetted, but that was 20 years back. Are we today in the same situation that we were 20 years ago, or has the reality on the ground moved on? Unfortunately, very unfair to the Palestinians. This is not how it should have been, but there's a reality on the ground, and how do you deal with that? And I think that's where the back channels are seeing, and that's where I hinted at that. Can an unorthodox Trump administration come up with an out-of-the-box solution which goes beyond the cliched formulations that we are all wedded to? And that would be interesting to see.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think your point about the two-state solution and how everyone thinks that's going to lead to some resolution, but no one's really talking about how we get there. That's going to echo with a lot of our colleagues in Carnegie, Beirut, especially, who've been asking, if you want the two-state solution, tell us what it's actually going to look like and how we get there. Dr. Saraswat, coming back to Iran, there are questions about the Supreme Leader's health, debates about regional policy. And so how is Tehran looking at sort of these multiple variables domestically, and how do you think it's going to lead to a recalibration of policy, particularly to the axis of resistance that you brought up earlier?
Right. So Iran's domestic politics has been, quite polarized for some years. The reformist, the moderate Rouhani administration, put its entire political capital in negotiating the JCPOA, and there were lots of hopes. And then they were, the Iranian population, which had voted them to power, was really dismayed. And then the maximum pressure really emboldened the hardliners, the IRGC, the principalists, and the moderates and the reformists were completely out of the corridors of power, like completely sidelined. But that changed all of a sudden with the election of Masoud Pezeshkian in June this year. I mean, not entirely, but it was a surprise win, right? That the reformist parliamentarian is allowed to contest by the Guardian Council, and then he comes back with similar promises not as exuberant, but again promising that that sanctions are going to be lifted and Iran's international relations can be normalized. And so today, when there are reformists back in power, and they are very much measured in terms of what they are promising, and their focus has been on consensus within Iran. And that we see, more of that we see in the last month, where, as it became clear that Trump is going to win, and then the IRGC, the principalists, the conservatives, they're all trying to, portray that, the battlefield and the diplomacy, they are not on different positions. We are going to be dealing with the new situation, the regional situation, with the changes in White House, from a position of strength. So, of course, when the question is about survival, survival of the system in face of domestic pressures and a fast-changing regional environment, and the changes in White House, the whole the Islamic Republic system is about projecting strength, is about sort of bridging the different positions, at least creating that kind of appearance that that we can handle the kind of challenges you're going to throw at us. So having said that, the divisions, they remain, and especially the question of succession. I mean, it's hard to say anything. Frankly, I mean, Ibrahim Raisi, he was being touted by some. I mean, even the way he was, his rise was orchestrated by the Supreme Leader. It appeared as if, his election was all about preparation for the succession. But then, with the reformists being elected, it's not very evident that the hardliners will have their way, and and the reformists and the moderates will have little say in how the succession will happen. And then we hear about Supreme Leader Khamenei's son, Mustafa Khamenei. He's been another fixture in this debate about succession, and his name keeps coming up. So, of course, for Iranians, amid this whole, changing, shifting regional situation, the domestic question, the question of the succession, and also the popular challenge, that remains. I mean, that's just something. There are no easy answers for that. So, as of now, it appears that the current administration, the opposition administration, is trying to sort of it's trying to wade through all these challenges by projecting this appearance of consensus among different factions.
Thank you, Dr. Saraswat. Ambassador Dharmendra, that brings us to a very crucial question. What do you think are the real consequences of Iran moves towards weaponization? And sort of equally important would be, how is this calculation, if at all, affected by the changing dynamics between Russia and China?
Thank you, Shivani. Just to recap, the Iranian posture has been, mostly, what do you say, kind of a negotiating strategy. They say that they are a nuclear threshold power. They have accumulated knowledge, they have accumulated resources, they have accumulated materials that cannot be done away with. You can remove some of the physical wherewithals, like the uranium stockpile and so on and so forth, but you can't remove the knowledge. So they have reached a certain level of capacity and capability in the nuclear domain. The other thing is, if they were to break out and declare themselves, then what will be the consequences? First, obviously, the UN Security Council will come in. There is going to be some kind of snapback, sanctions, or punitive measures. What will then be the regional consequences? The Saudis, particularly Crown Prince MBS, has already declared that if Iran were to go nuclear, then there is no choice for the Saudis, they'll have to go nuclear. That will come back to where the Saudi-Israel rapprochement will be, where the Saudi-Israel-US dynamics will play out, because one of the areas the Saudis have been pushing for was access to nuclear energy. And access to the full fuel cycle, which is you mine and you reprocess. The entire cycle is what the Saudis are negotiating as perhaps one of the trade-offs for some rapprochement with the Israelis. Now, will the Americans give that to them? Because that will require a lot of internal amendments to their own nuclear regulations. We have a difficulty here in terms of, a challenge rather, of cascading problems. If then Saudis go, then Turkey will go, then Egypt will go. So we'll have a very, very unstable nuclear region, which can have grave consequences for peace and stability. So far, if we parse through the Iranian commentary, the Iranian signaling, there's some kind of mutual balancing going on. They say, look, we want sanctions relief. You give us sanctions relief, we will take a step back. So they stopped at 60%. They said, we have the capability to go up, but they said, okay, we'll stop at 60%. Now, 60% is negotiation. So like I said earlier, they're all preparing the groundwork for the future in terms of what then will be the give and take between the Iranians and the Americans and the IAEA, the EU3. Apparently, some discussions are taking place in Geneva between Iran and the EU3. This may pave the way for a post-January formal engagement. There's one joker in the pack here, which is the Iranian involvement in the Ukraine conflict, which has been taken very badly by the Europeans, who've also imposed multiple sanctions on Iran, and the Iran-Russia-China relationship. Along with the Iran reconciliation with the GCC, particularly the Saudis, the Iranians have really strengthened their relations with China and Russia, bilaterally and through frameworks like the BRICS and the SCO. So moving forward, post-March, I would suggest that, once the next IAEA report on Iran is issued in the first quarter of 2025, we may then see what will be the groundwork for future negotiations. These really have to be direct negotiations. This indirect methodology is again a stalling Iranian, typical stalling tactics. So we'll have to see how that goes forward. But like I said, they're on the back foot externally, particularly the kind of blows the Axis has taken. So the IRGC and others are slightly on the back foot, which will take us back to Deepika's point about succession. The IRGC is going to be a big player in any succession issues which may come up post Supreme Leader Khamenei. That position has been slightly weakened given the setbacks the IRGC has received in the region. So their negotiating position within, there are multiple factions in Iran. Hardliners, in the hardliners, like Deepika said, there's the principalists, then there's the Ahmadinejad faction, then there are the clerics in Qom, the clerics in Mashhad. Mujtaba Khamenei is based in Qom. What will be their position? Then there is the Assembly of Experts, which is the ultimate decider on a succession. So if you take the external, Axis, diminution of the Axis's capability, therefore a setback to Iran's forward defense strategy. Then you come back to the nuclear. Nuclear has been mostly posturing. It's been showing intent, some demonstration of intent, but not really crossing the threshold, which will be it will have consequences. Like I said, Saudis, Turkey, Egypt, what will be their response to this? Not just Israel. And also when talking about Israel, the Israelis have claimed, according to Western media reports, that they have been able to strike nuclear weapons research facilities north of Tehran, a town called Parchin. So if that be the case, then maybe, there will be setback, but we've seen Iran, sabotaging of their nuclear facilities, assassination of their scientists has not deterred them. They've moved forward. Recently, the Majlis has tabled a proposal that Iran should conduct further research into nuclear power, which is basically a code word for what will be the potential of breakout. So we'll have to watch these developments closely. And Trump, as one of our panelists said, had in 2019 offered a deal to the Iranians on the nuclear question. Of course, Iran was very, very upset. They were very angry with Trump, and they said he can't be trusted, and we are not going to do a deal with him. Reports that Prime Minister Abe of Japan had carried a message on behalf of the Americans, so on, and all these various reports had come up at that time. But we are here now. We'll have to see how the Iranians will now, Iranians and the Americans will take forward the negotiation.
Thank you, sir. I think there's one group of actors that we haven't sort of discussed so far, and those are the non-state actors. I was hoping, Mr. Taneja, you could share how you are looking at the Gulf's perspectives, because we're seeing increasing concerns in the GCC about groups like Hamas, particularly sort of ideological connections to the Muslim Brotherhood. So, how are the Gulf countries kind of processing this challenge? And this seems especially relevant given the potential role in reconstruction.
Uh, Thanks, Shibani. I think that's a very, very good question, and that's also a very sort of understudied question because look, there have been trends over the past couple of years where a lot of these non-state militant groups who, let's say, the US has been fighting in the post 9/11 war on terror era for almost 20 years, are finding small pockets of victories now. Or have been at least for the past couple of years, you know, the coming back to power of the Taliban in Kabul was actually a watershed moment because you know, here's an insurgency that the Americans went to fight in post 2001, and you know, all those years later, all those trillions of dollars later, they were back at the center of power without actually having to fight much in Kabul. You know, when the Taliban took fort, you know, one of the first people to congratulate them was Ismail Haniyeh of Hamas. And Ismail Haniyeh, I remember in a statement or in a video somewhere, said that what the Taliban has achieved shows that others can do as well. That, you know, the US is defeatable, that Israel is defeatable, that we just have to sort of follow the path of what we are trying to achieve. Now, of course, you know, since then, a lot has changed, even from the Taliban perspective in Afghanistan. But Hamas has been fairly degraded for now. I think the fact that you know, post Sinwar's killing, we haven't really seen a very clear hierarchical structure for the organization, shows that they are in dire straits at this point of time. So Israel has managed to sort of deal them a severe blow. If you see even Hezbollah, you know, it shows the kind of intelligence penetration that took place over the past couple of years, especially after 2006. And a lot of that Israel only managed to mobilize now after October, which is more of a political decision rather than a tactical decision from the Israeli side. But even, you know, the new sort of if you see some of the profiles, the early profiles of the new Hezbollah chief, you know, they see him as a very uncharismatic character compared to Hassan Nasrallah. Or even Saifuddin, who was supposed to take over but did not take over. Having said that, you know, both of these organizations have taken severe blows, but those blows have been either political or tactical, right? Strategically, I think at least Hezbollah remains in not a formidable, but on a balanced position. They continue to launch attacks on Israel almost on a daily basis. That shows that their depth of their missile arsenal and other weaponry remains, although there have been setbacks to the organization. You know, having said that, the ideological and the political part of it is not going anywhere. So you know, I think all of them, especially Israel, after October last year, had this mandate that, you know, they have to recover their lost idea of security, and that they have to show that, you know, that they can fight back, that they cannot be defeated. And what happened in October last year is an anomaly, and they will not let it happen again. So all those kind of narratives have been sort of existing parallelly. But as far as the sort of you know, existence of Hamas and Hezbollah is concerned, even if Hamas is degraded to the point that it is not Hamas anymore, we will see an alternative Hamas come to fore, especially after the kind of violence that Gaza has witnessed over the past 1 year. Hezbollah is much more different. I think Hezbollah is much more critical to Iran, and Iran is going to make sure that Hezbollah survives in one shape or the other in Lebanon to sort of maintain the power of the Shia community and the Shia representation in Lebanon. You have to remember that within Lebanon also there have been multiple sort of ethnical and religious factions that have come and taken power and then been sort of thrown out of power through force. And finally, I just want to, in all this, mention the Houthis. And now the Houthis is probably the finest example right now of a militant organization succeeding immeasurably over the past couple of months in both capacity and technologies that they have acquired largely through Iranian equipment. That over the past couple of months they've managed to divert trade worth more than $100 billion from the Red Sea by basically using very rudimentary systems of weapons, attacking commercial ships, but also attacking military ships, including American warships. From a ragtag organization that used to share one Kalashnikov with 4 fighters, they are now fairly uniformed. They have limited range, but there are ballistic missiles. There are much more advanced weaponry. There are autonomous weapons, both in sea and air, that they're using. So their rise has been very, very unchallenged. And although there are a lot of analysis that is coming that they may be the next sort of Hamas or Hezbollah to take on Israel, but I think geographically that seems quite unreasonable. But within the Yemen structure, they've even forced the Saudis to talk to them now, and the Saudis went to war against the Houthis a couple of years ago. So just broadly, a lot of these militant organizations will see what is happening as something that they can mobilize around. And they will see some of these at least as victories on what they're trying to achieve ideologically and politically in the long term. So I think we are only going to see a renewed cycle of these kind of activities taking place and these kind of actors coming up every now and again in the near future.
Thank you for that. Ambassador Dharmendra, I think you wanted to come in.
Oh, very quickly, just to add to Kabir's point about the Houthis, there have been reports that Houthi mercenaries have now reached Ukraine on behalf of Russia. I don't know if anyone has any confirmation or corroboration of that. I just wanted to comment on that.
I haven't seen that.
I'll open it up to our participants now. We do have some questions lined up, and also if the panelists want to comment on each other's remarks, then please feel free. Aishwarya's first question is, Kabir has sort of answered it in terms of what is India's stance towards the conflict in Gaza and how has the position changed? Are there any sort of noticeable changes when compared with India's historic position? I'm going to pick Bashir's question. It's not addressed to a particular panelist, but how does one explain MBS going out of his way to express support for Iranian sovereignty in Riyadh at the Riyadh summit after Trump's victory? If Riyadh is preparing for Trump 2.0, what explains this proactiveness that clearly deviates from last Riyadh summit statements?
Well, let me take a shot at that. Towards the fag end of the Trump 1.0 administration, you had this reality check that the Saudis and the Emiratis got when there were these series of attacks against Aramco facilities, against shipping, against even 2 attacks in Abu Dhabi, one in Riyadh, etc. And particularly when the Aramco facility was attacked and it took, I think, a third of Saudi's oil output out of the system, there was an expectation from the Saudis that this would at least provoke the Americans to come and support them. But short of words, there wasn't very much. So I think what happened in those few months towards, I think, August, September of 2019 was a reality check from for the Emiratis and the Saudis that the American defense and security umbrella wasn't exactly what they thought it would be. And given the rise of asymmetric warfare and asymmetric capabilities that the Iranians had developed in the region, they would be better off making peace rather than, or creating some modicum of, relationship rather than having the really strained ties that they had until that point. So if you see in a timeline, then 2020 onwards, you see all of these hesitant steps, back channel talks in Oman and Iraq and so on, eventually leading to the kind of thaw that we have seen. So I think people remember that, and you are today in a situation where even as the Saudis try to negotiate a security and defense umbrella with the Americans, they are not holding their breath. They know that at the end of the day, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Iranians, the Iraqis have to learn to get along with each other and not allow external factors to create the kind of fissures that they have had. So I think there's been a reality check, and that's why you see that Riyadh will be very happy with Trump 2.0, but at the same time is under no illusions that that's going to be a panacea for problems in the region, that they need to have their own modus vivendi with the Iranians.
Yes, Deepika.
Yeah, I'm just going to stick my neck out and just take this point a little further. This whole idea that regional security could be, arrived at by Gulf states by isolating Iran, by containing Iran, or making some kind of anti-Iranian coalition. I think that they may have reconsidered that, and I mean, again, other panelists may have different ideas. And here, I think the role of China is also important. Increasingly, you see, China is putting forward the idea of cooperative security, and there have been several rounds of discussions involving different players from the region in Beijing, and the GCC China dialogue that has intensified. I think China is increasingly sort of taking a little more proactive role in terms of how regional security is imagined, and that's qualitatively different from how US has done things, how US has sort of underwritten the regional security architecture. So to my mind, it seems China is also, given the economic influence it has, interest it has, it is also taking greater interest in how security discussions in the region. And there may be alternative approaches to regional security that may become significant going forward. Yeah, I end here.
Can I just come in? Yeah, Deepika, it's a valid point, but also I think Ambassador Suri nailed it. I think September 2019 was really a revelation to the GCC countries when Iranian drones, of course, Iran denies it, struck the Aramco oil storage depots in Abqaiq and Khurais. I think that was a very, very important. And also during that same time, the Iranians brought down an American Global Hawk MQ-4 or MQ-9, one of the drones. So Iranians did demonstrate a capability during that time, including by sabotaging shipping, I think, which triggered these steps then to baby steps to begin with to reconcile and bring a neighborhood stability. Iran also, if that time, if you remember, Foreign Minister Javed Zarif had proposed a hope, Hormuz peace endeavor, something for steps, basically a CBM step, which has now come to fruition. But as regards your other point on China, I think it's a kind of a glass half full, glass half empty situation. China actually gives greater weightage to commerce. And if that commerce is secured by American blood and treasure or others, they're quite happy to do so. They're not going to stick their neck out looking at security. We see Balochistan, the kind of difficulties they're having in Gwadar, but they expect the Pakistanis to take the necessary steps. Ditto in the Gulf. So while they kind of do this shosha about getting everybody to Beijing or conducting meetings, when the rubber hits the road, the Chinese are very reluctant to enter into any security arrangements. It's all commercial and mercantilist driven. So we'll have to see when that will change and how that will change. But for the time being, I think there is greater drive by the regional powers, regional countries to stabilize their own neighborhood. There are difficulties. The Emiratis and the Iranians have territorial problems on the greater and little Tomb Islands rather. Iranians, Saudis, and Kuwaitis have do not agree on where the Arash gas fields end, whose jurisdiction. So there are these difficulties, but they're able to reconcile. But the biggest problem is going to be American sanctions, and particularly American security sanctions and secondary sanctions. This has been a sobering fact for any Chinese investments in Iran. They're taking place. China is buying oil from Iran, but at some stage, once the Trump administration comes in, they might tighten the Chinese and tell them to stop buying oil, which can pressure the Iranians. The Saudis do not want to invest in Iran. They've been making comments. The foreign minister, the finance ministers have met. They've talked about investments into Iran infrastructure, which Iran desperately needs capital infusion. And that's not going to happen for the time being, so long as sanctions are in place. Therefore, Iranians have been pressing for sanctions relief. So I just wanted to comment on that.
Sorry, just very quickly, three very short points. First and foremost, the reorientation, whatever reorientation took place post the attacks on the Saudi oil facilities, where the Saudis sort of rethought their strategies on let's say fighting the Houthis and how they were dealing with Iran. It did work because we haven't heard anything of that sort for a long period of time now. Right, so none of those drones have penetrated the Saudi airspace for a long period of time. So whatever that rearrangement and realignment was from the Saudi side, it did work, but it was also, I think, done. We have to remember that there was a lot of pressure on MBS at that point of time that his policies were quite heavy-handed. So a lot of those things took place. Very quickly on China, look, we keep on hearing about China, even if you travel to the region, especially with Iran and the Chinese deal that took place couple of years back. And the fact that the Chinese have actually thrown their relationship with Israel under the bus, over the past couple of months. The Chinese will not get into an idea of security the way the Americans have, because the Chinese have lambasted that idea of American security for a long period of time now, both in diplomacy and on paper. That that the heavy-handedness with which the Americans sort of entered Iraq and so on and so forth, or the military first approach that they often keep, it has been detrimental to security in the Middle East. So that the idea that the Chinese are actually going to take part in any kind of deployments beyond a point, which are bilateral in nature and fairly peaceful in nature. I don't think the Chinese are going to get involved in a broader security arrangement in any shape or form. Hence, that automatically means that for the Saudis, the Emiratis, and even the Iranians, some sort of engagement or some sort of talk with the Americans is imperative. You can't put it out, because ultimately at the end of the day, they still remain as the only country with the highest deployment numbers when it comes to aircraft, troops, and so on and so forth. So just keeping that in mind when we are talking about the depth at which the Chinese influence in the region looks like, at least.
I think this would be a good time to bring in Nico's question about how the panelists see India's reaction to China's increasing influence in the region, whether it's infrastructure or the political involvement. So if anyone would like to comment on that.
I think everyone would.
Maybe we'll do that. We'll take a round of comments because we're also closing. So, final thoughts and also your views on China's involvement in the region.
Well,
I'll go for, okay.
yeah, go ahead, go ahead, Jan.
Sir, after you, sir.
So, I mentioned in my opening comments that China's the elephant in the room when we talk Trump 2.0. Don't disconnect Washington, China from whatever you see in the region, because there's going to be that larger picture at work behind the scenes in terms of the initiatives that you see in the region. I am totally, in agreement with what Ambassador Harminder said and Kabir said about China in the region. Even when China was trying to actively do some kind of an Israel-Palestine peace process, people used to kind of laugh at it. That has China been willing to put its money where its mouth is? Forget security, even financially. What is the quantum of assistance that they give to the Palestinians financially? Everybody scoffs at America, but America was until recently still one of the largest contributors to UNRWA. So, there's been a big gap between what Chinese kind of project in the region and what the ground reality is. And from the region itself, obviously, while they understand that reality, there is an effort to overproject China so that it improves negotiating positions with the Americans and so on. So the Emiratis will deliberately use the Wing-Lung drone in somewhere to show it off that if you guys don't give me the MQ-9, I've got an alternative. And I think it plays reasonably well into that. You won't give me the F-35s, I'll talk to the Russians for the Su-35s or something like that. So China's influence in the region is expanding, but it certainly isn't the 800-pound gorilla that it's sometimes made out to be.
I agree. If you remember in 2021, first half of 2021, Iran and China entered into a 25-year comprehensive cooperation agreement. In the run-up to that, debates in the Iranian Majlis, in the Iranian media, were quite interesting to watch. There was a lot of anti-China sentiment. They were saying, why are we doing this with the Chinese? Why are we giving them land? They went after the Rouhani government and the Majlis. There was, huge debates on what should be the extent of engagement with China. There were, in fact, also calls for demonstrations in front of the Chinese embassy, quite unprecedented. All this was obviously, it's a controlled state media, so it was all put down. But there remain doubts about both in Iran. There remain doubts and skepticism and a fair amount of distrust on engagement with both China and Russia. With Russia, the Iranians have a tradition. There's a history of colonialism. The Iranians blame Russia for the division of Azerbaijan, the province of Azerbaijan. There are those colonial hangovers which still remain in Iran. With China, the distrust is we must look at it from the Iranian perspective. They feel that the Chinese are opportunists. They will throw them under the bus when they have to do a deal with the Americans. So they'll engage the Chinese to the extent that they will benefit, knowing fully well that this is a very, very opportunistic relationship. So I totally agree with Ambassador Suri that it's not the 800-pound gorilla that it's made out to be, or it projects for itself. There's a fair bit of skepticism, and do keep in mind, the Iranians have not come on board the BRI and the CPEC. There's been a lot of pressure from the Chinese to use the Afghan route and the Iranian route. Rather, they've decided to partner with us in the development and progress of the Chabahar through the INSTC. So we'll have to look at those signalings also, which the Iranians are conveying, not just to us, but to the Chinese and to the others, that, we trust the Indians, we'll work with them. Important signals. I think we'll have to keep that in mind when analyzing how the local regional countries are also looking at China, not just how China is looking at them, and how we should look at China's involvement in the region. I think it would be useful for us to look at also what the Tehran's perspective on engaging Beijing will be, and engaging Abu Dhabi and New Delhi. I think it gives us an interesting insight. Thanks.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Saraswat, if you'd like to come in.
Okay. Yeah, just quickly, very quickly. See, I think China is welcomed in the region by all these players in the Persian Gulf for different reasons. Iran looks at China as a power that can counterbalance the United States. And the Gulf, of course, is worried about the US retrenchment for a very long time, over 10 years, and they have welcomed Chinese rule. So my short point is that China's, as the other panelists have argued, that it's not the 800-pound gorilla, but to me, it looks like the Chinese role is on the rise and is being welcomed by all the actors for different reasons. And it will be, now they've taken a greater role in the the negotiations between Iran and Saudi. I think they're going to take greater interest in security issues, and India will have to be prepared for that.
Yeah, okay. Just very quickly, look, I think China is a bit of a one-trick pony. Right. So basically, they have the economic might that they can mobilize. But historically, if you see, not historically, but if you see in the recent past, they've never been good with understanding the intricacies of a region or a culture or a society. They come and try to deal with the top of a state. And the filtering down really doesn't happen. The prime example of that has been Pakistan over the recent months, where even something as sort of involved as they are in Pakistan, even the fact that they haven't been able to understand even the Baloch issue properly shows that they're very sort of politically averse to a lot of things that they get into. As long as the economic dividends are coming, I don't think they try to get into a lot of the intricacies of these regions too much. Maybe, we can always argue whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. But if you are sort of looking for deeper partnerships, let's say in the Middle East, I think just having this sort of that we want to do deals or we want to do just business has limited sort of mobility to it. This is despite the fact, they hosted Hamas also, and they've hosted, they were involved in the Saudi-Iran detente. But I think that's, as Ambassador Suri pointed out earlier, that's just their current situation of being the second largest economy and a very good conduit to pressurize, let's say, the US to get things done. That's their primary role, I think, in the Middle East right now. And after that, it's business. And maybe if other things are left there, they'll be able to do that also. Security, definitely not at this time, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. I think the sign of a good discussion is that we all leave with more questions and more food for thought. As we draw to a close, I want to thank our panelists for sort of helping us make a little more sense of what's happening in West Asia. There are several key questions that we didn't get a chance to touch upon, including what will reconstruction look like? What are the governance challenges going to be in that process? How will regional organizations play a role in future security arrangements? And what are the mechanisms that might emerge to prevent future escalations of violence? These are just some of the questions that will undoubtedly continue to shape discussions in capitals across the world. Thank you to our audience for their participation and thoughtful questions. And thanks again to our panelists for sharing their expertise and insights. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Shivani.
Thank you, Shivani. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.